you know, this really worked out well for me to be able to do this with you at 7. So let me show you what I've got here. I have something that I started earlier. And I wanted to show you this drawing also because I'm going to be working on a different colored paper tonight. So this paper that I'm working on is Canson paper. It is sort of a warm light brown. And what I have that I'm working with is, if you take a look at my setup here, I've got some pumpkins, a delicata squash, a butternut squash, and these are my objects. I have them on a white piece of paper with an overhead light. And how I would like to start this evening is by talking a little bit about value scale. So pastel is a really great medium to work with in terms of color, right? It can be very painterly. In fact, sometimes people call pastel drawings pastel paintings, right? So, but something that I find really helpful is the relationship of color to value. So when I'm talking about value, I'm talking about the lightness or darkness of a color. And so if I relate my colors to kind of a gray scale, let's see. Really, this would be a little bit better on white paper. But if I relate my colors to a grayscale, I can kind of order them from dark to light. So if I have in my set, and let me show you what I'm working with tonight is kind of a mix of soft pastels and hard pastels. So I'll talk about the difference in a moment. But what I have, if I start laying out my colors in terms of value, I could think about like what are my darkest colors? And they're probably going to be my purples and my blues. I happen to know that brown in my set, if I just zoom in here to my little tiny color scale here, brown in my set is pretty dark in terms of value scale, right? Like light to dark. So brown, blue, purple, those are all pretty dark. I have a dark green. Green and red tend towards the middle of the value scale. So
Katie, why would you start with doing a value scale? What does that help you with in your final drawing?
Well, what that helps me with is it helps me render something round. So like when I'm looking at this pumpkin that I drew, right, it helps that I have light on the top of the pumpkin, and then I have my midtones, right, and then I have my shadows. So if I understand what I'm doing with light and dark, that really helps my color choice. So I can kind of get the overall picture of roundness while still using a lot of different colors.
So do you usually start with doing a color scale to prepare yourself for drawing something?
Not always. This is something that I do, this little scale, this little value scale compared to color. This is something that I do with my classes. And I think in my head when I'm starting a drawing, I do think about whether color is light or dark. And so this is just a way to kind of lay it out visually that's kind of like ready to go, right? So if I were unsure about, you know, my green, what my green looks like. I could lay these out and then I would have a little bit better idea. And if you do this at the bottom of your paper, then you kind of have it ready to go. So I have these light greens and really light yellow. This is almost like white. So this is going to be towards the lighter end of my value scale. And in the middle, it gets kind of murky. It can be a little bit hard to tell. Like I have some pinks and some oranges. But if I can kind of get the gist of it, about where they might be, like this blue, I'm not sure about. Let's take a look at it. So,
Katie,
yeah.
what kind of paper would you recommend for doing pastel drawings? I know you told us about your paper that you're using. What variety of papers would you recommend for pastel drawings? And should they be different colors, or is white okay?
Yeah, I think white is okay. Colors, if you work on different colors, what you'll find is that different colors pop on different colors of paper, different colors of pastel, I should say, pop on different colors of paper. And so the paper that I'm using, it has a bit of texture to it. And you can see that if I zoom in here really close to my little scale, you might be able to see some of the texture. There's kind of like a grid. You can see
I
it
can sort of see that, yeah.
Orange patch. So there's a little bit of like a grid texture. And I really like this. And Canson, a lot of times, if you look at Canson papers, some of the pads that you can buy are dual-sided. So there'll be like a more textured surface on one side and a little bit less of a texture on the other side. And that can be really helpful. Some people prefer not to see the grain of the paper in their drawing, but I really like that. And so one thing that I'll show you tonight is that I like to leave a little bit of the texture showing in my drawing. And that's not to say that you can't work another way, like fill in more of the paper and build up layers. Sometimes people will work with pastel and they really blend together, and you can use a blending cloth or a blending stump or something to get those colors really mixed together. But I find that I like more of an optical effect. So that's like laying one color down and allowing either the paper to show through, or, you know, as I build layers on top of it, instead of mixing them together, I'm letting one color show through underneath and building on top of it so that both of those colors are there, versus if I put a color down and I put another color on top of it, I can blend that. And that kind of fills in the texture of the paper, and it also evenly mixes those two colors together. So there's two, you know, there's kind of two thoughts here. We can work showing some of the colors underneath, whether it's paper or an underlayer of pastel, or we can use our hands or a blending stump or cloth to blend the colors together and get a more even mix.
Can you talk a little bit about the nature of pastels, any kind of precautions you should take when working with pastels?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So pastels, they do produce dust, right? So we want to be careful when working with something that produces dust. We don't really want to be breathing that in. Although a lot of pastels that you'll get do have an AP seal on them, which is it's sort of like a way of grading art supplies. And so I think that if you get something with an AP seal, that is it tends to be on the safer side. But that being said, it's dust and you don't really want to be breathing that in. So sometimes when I work, I'm working down on a flat table. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm working vertically, so I have my easel set up here. And so there's a little lip on my easel that's catching my dust here. And what I would do, and if I were working like directly on a desk or like my kitchen table, I would just be cautious, be aware of the dust that I'm creating, and I would never blow on my paper. I would just kind of like tap it off to the side and get some of that dust so that I could collect it. And then I would use a sponge, something not used for food, sort of like an old sponge to kind of clean my work area. So that's how I would deal with the little bit of dust that I'm creating. So I'm gonna switch papers here. I'll come back to this drawing because I want you to see the difference in colors that I'm working with. So here's my green piece of paper. I want to make sure that I'm working on, this paper is not dual-sided. So I want to make sure that I'm working on the textured side of the paper. And I am. This is the textured side. And when I start drawing, I'm going to start by blocking in. So I'm going to work very lightly to start. And I'm not going to choose the lightest color that I'm going to use. I'm going to choose something a little bit more towards the middle or the darker side. And that's just because I'm going to work up to my lights. So what I'm using to start here is orange. This is a soft pastel. It is a big stick. Oh, I was going to mention the difference between soft and hard pastels. Soft pastels have less binder in them, so that means more pigment. Hard pastels have more binder in them, and so that means a little bit less pigment. So the more binder you have, the less pigment you have, right? Something that is really soft and crumbly has very little binder in it, and so it's the most potent, it's the most pigment. If you want a little bit more control when you're working, maybe you want to use some hard pastels. It's the same material, it's just the amount of binder that's different. So all I'm doing here is I'm kind of like looking at the mass of my two subjects here. I have a butternut squash, that's this, and I'm gonna have a pumpkin here. So I'm working my way up. I'm not getting too heavy with the pastel to start. And I'm also thinking about what colors are friends with each other. So I know I have an orange pumpkin, but it's kind of boring to just use orange. So I have a little bit of yellow orange in here, and I'm adding some red to it. And when I work in the shadows, I'm going to have some shadows in here. I think about, I'm working on green paper, so maybe I can let a little bit of that green paper show through in my shadow areas. Or maybe I want to add some green or some blue, something that is a little bit darker in terms of value. And also, when I'm creating shadow, I think a lot about complements. So here's some blue. This is coming out really intense in my drawing. So I don't want my shadow to be that bright, but I do want it to be that dark. So this is something I'm going to alter as I keep working. I'm also going to put some of this on the butternut squash.
So you're using blue as the shadow, because it also complements the orange?
Yes, right. And here's where my stem is going to be. It's a little bit hard to see with the color I just put in, but this is intentional. I don't want to go too dark with it or too light. I'm choosing a green that's kind of in the middle of the road just to outline the shape. And if you can see this here, it's subtle, but there's my shape for my stem.
Your subjects are very appropriate for the season.
Oh yeah, yeah. I went hunting for some gourds. I found some good ones. I went to a couple different places. So now that I have this blue on here and I want to tone it down a little bit, we said the opposite of blue on the color wheel is orange, right? Blue and orange are complements. So if I work lightly, I'm just adding a little bit of orange to my blue. And again, I'm using the texture of the paper, but I could also blend this together with my hands. And that just takes away some of the intensity of the blue, the intensity of the color. And again, I'm slowly working my way up to light here. Where's the light? So here's some light kind of yellow. This is like a kind of yellow orange. And I'm adding some highlight here. Again, if that's coming out a little too intense, I think it's okay for now. But if it comes out a little too intense, you can balance it back, right? So I have yellow, kind of yellow orange. I might use a little bit of purple if I wanted to kind of dial that back a little bit. So I don't want these two forms to start looking the same color. So I'm going to see what else I have here that I can introduce. Like I'm noticing there's kind of like a warmness to the butternut squash. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of pink in here. And this pink is on the lighter side, so I'm using it in the highlighted areas where the light is hitting this. And this is a little bit of orange. I'm going to work on the creases of the pumpkin a little bit. So orange is darker than yellow. So I'm adding a little bit of orange. I'm also going to add a little bit of green and see if I can get these creases to kind of start to come out a little bit. So my green, I think that was a little too light. I'm going to use a little bit darker green. Maybe even some blue, which is even darker on my value scale. So I'm building these creases, working a little bit in my shadow again. And I'm also looking at the shape of the cat shadow under these gourds. So I'm just outlining my shadow here a little bit so I can find the shape here. And I'm using this lighter color. This is green. It's a very light green. I'm using this for the area of light on the table surface. how much of it I want to do yet. I think I might like to leave some of the paper showing, so I'll leave it at that for right now. The other thing we have to remember is that with round things, we get a little bit of reflected light towards the bottom. So I'm seeing that on the pumpkin here.
Katie, do you have suggestions on how to use the chalk, like how to hold it in your hand, how to like apply it to the surface?
Sure, yeah. I think the great thing about pastels being in a stick is that you can use the whole surface of it, right, versus a pencil where you can only use the point of it. If you have something that's square, you can drag the side of it across the drawing, but you can also, so kind of like I was just doing for my light on the table, I'm dragging the side of the pastel across the paper. But then if I wanted to turn it and use the edge, I could also make a really fine line. So here's my blue again, because this is pretty dark. So I'm adding some blue into the stem. It's not going to be that blue to stay, but for right now, I'm just laying in some dark.
So is blue your go-to for creating shadows or dark tones?
Not necessarily. I think it depends on the color of the paper. So I also have purple, which is pretty dark in terms of the value. And so I'm going to add a little bit of purple in here too. I think it really depends on the paper that you're working on and the object that you're working with, what color that is.
So do you ever use like pure black?
I don't. And I can show you on my other drawing here in a moment. I started incorporating some black into the pumpkin that I was working on. Let me show you this here. And I think it looks really different. So this is, there's actually a little bit of black in the stem. And it looks really different to me, but you know, I started doing this and I thought, oh no, I don't want that. So I just stopped. This delicata squash at the bottom, this has no black in it. And I think it has a little bit of a different quality. So yeah, I mean, you can use black. I think there are a lot more interesting solutions though. So maybe eventually you get to a little bit of black, but you know, there are lots of other ways to make something a little bit dark without going straight to black. And that's kind of my approach to applying color here too, right? I'm not going straight to the local color that I see. I'm not going straight to pumpkin orange, right? I'm trying to incorporate different colors in here because that's what's interesting to me about pastels.
So are you seeing the colors that you're incorporating in the drawing, or are you incorporating colors that you think will move the drawing forward?
It's a little bit of both. So when I look at this, I kind of notice if something is looking warm or cool. And I kind of notice, you know, if the shadows are deep or not so deep. So here I'm using a little bit of, making some kind of smaller marks here. And I also want to step back from this as I'm working because I think with pastels, sometimes we get into the trap of kind of like filling in the paper so much that it can get a little bit muddy, and I'm starting, I think, to get a little bit muddy in some of these parts of the shadow. So I'm just taking a step back from that. I'll come back to it, but for now. So here's my stem I'm building. I see there's light hitting the top of the stem. And let's see what this is. Testing my colors here. Okay. And there's a little bit of shadow to one side. And so I want to make that stem that's in shadow. This is the shadow side. Make that a little bit darker. So I do a little bit of purple, a little bit of bluish green. And I'm adding just a hint of orange to that to kind of dull it down a little bit.
So there is like a really painterly quality because you can actually mix colors, even though it's a dry medium.
Right, right. So it's like where in watercolor or, you know, if you're painting with acrylic, you can, I mean, even with watercolor, you can layer colors on the paper, right? But you can also mix a little pool of it in your palette. So here, right, all the mixing is done directly on the paper.
Are there pastel works of art or artists that inspire you that you would recommend that we look at?
Yes, I really like, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her last name. Sally Strand. She's a contemporary artist, and she is a master of kind of working with light and shadow. And she's easy to find. Her work is easy to find online, and there are books of hers out. Let's see here. So,
Wow. I'm just looking at her work. Wow.
Yeah. This is sort of the rainbow pumpkin that I'm coming up with here. We can compare it to the other one at the end. Let's see which one works better. I'm going to put some more green back into my stem here. There's purple in there. So I guess I'm always kind of like playing this game in my head, like light or dark, bright or dull. And then it always helps to think about like contrasting colors. So if I want this pumpkin to kind of like pop out. I mean, I'm kind of doing this with the light that's on the table. But
Is that in your background, Katie?
yeah,
Okay.
that was a car going by,
Yeah.
playing some music.
Cool.
So I just kind of keep going back and forth here, where working, bringing up the light, kind of checking it out, dulling it back down if I need to.
And by dulling it, do you just mean putting complementary colors in?
Yeah.
Is that how you dull something? Okay.
Right, right.
So question from the audience. So oil pastels are not really great for this, or are they?
Oil pastels?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, they're different material. I think,
So they would work differently than what you're doing right now?
yes, they would, definitely. So they would blend differently, right? So this is all dry. The binder is different.
Mm-hmm. What do you prefer working with, oil or dry pastels?
I like dry pastels.
And what brand of pastels would you recommend?
I really have a mix. I would say for someone who's just starting out and they're not sure, I would go maybe with Sargent or something inexpensive. But I think Sennelier is a really good brand. They're known for pretty potent color. And sometimes I'm just sort of like barely touching the surface with the pastel. I'm just kind of like scumbling over the surface. Kind of like a little doodling mark.
Katie, could you repeat the names of the pastels that you're using?
Sure. Some of these in my set are Sargent. And some of them, a good brand to get is Sennelier.
How do you spell that?
I think it's Senneelier or something like that. So here I'm using a really strong contrasting color in my negative space. And I'm doing this to see if I can push this pumpkin forward a bit more in the space of the drawing. And I'm using the broad side of the pastel. I'm still letting the paper show through. And And I don't want these shadows to have a super hard edge, so I can even like drag the pastel lightly into the shape of the shadow that I created. Let's see. I did put some blue here, and now I have to kind of counteract that a little bit. Sort of a blue outline. So maybe what I would do, I'm going to work a little bit of blue into my table surface. I could also probably erase this because it's not too heavy.
How do you erase?
How do you erase? I would get a rubber eraser. I have one just nearby here.
So do you just works like just like a pencil eraser?
Yep. So I have a stick eraser and I have like a white rubber eraser. Not so white anymore, but this is a stick eraser. Here's my white rubber eraser. And actually, yeah, so if there's not very much on the surface, if it's a really dense area, it's a little bit harder to do this. But I can get back the original color of the paper because I wasn't working too heavily. So I can take out that kind of blue outline that I had for the shadow, which is what was kind of interfering there.
Katie, what is the difference in working with oil pastels? What's the result that's different, or how's the process different?
You know, I really haven't worked too much with oil pastels, but I do know that they feel waxier and they have like a different quality to them. So if you put them on the paper, you're not going to be able to erase them like I just did. You're not going to be able, you can blend with them a little bit, but the blending, it comes out a little bit differently. I think it's not as easy to blend colors together. You have to kind of to work them together a little bit more physically.
Would you do that with your hand, or would you do that with like an actual tool of some sort?
With oil pastel, I don't know. I guess you could do that with a blending stump. But yeah, maybe, I know that I've seen, there are different blending implements that I've seen in the art store, and they kind of look like, paint brushes, but they have like a rubber nib at the end instead of a brush. So something like that. I mean, I'm just kind of guessing here, not having worked with them very much, but something like that would probably work.
Now, with the dry pastels that you're working with, can you tell us a little bit about the process of safeguarding the drawing for exhibition or framing, or just keeping it as a pastel drawing?
Sure. Yeah, there's spray fixative that you can spray your drawing with. And sometimes people prefer to spray their drawing in layers. So like maybe I would stop right now and spray my drawing and then keep working on it. So you want to make sure when you're getting fixative you notice if it's workable fixative or permanent fixative. So something that's workable means that you can spray it as you're working, right? Let it kind of dry a little bit and then work back over it. So something that's a little bit more permanent, you might reserve that for the end. And if I were just transporting this drawing somewhere, I would probably take a piece of newsprint, or if I were working smaller, maybe like wax paper, and put it on top of the drawing, and I would just tape it. I would put like 2 little hinges of tape at the top. And what that would do is it would just kind of like keep this from contacting another surface.
Albert just told us that another teacher also recommends aerosol hairspray as a fixative, though you have to use it lightly.
Yeah, I've heard of that before. I haven't actually tried that, but yes. So now I'm looking at this and I think I might actually want to brighten up the shadows a tiny bit. So again, I continue to work lightly here. So I'm thinking about incorporating a little bit more purple into my shadows on the pumpkin. And I'm just noticing like where the ridges are catching light and where they're in shadow. So here, the ridges in the pumpkin are catching a little bit of light. So I'm looking really carefully here, and sometimes I'm squinting my eyes too. So if I'm having trouble seeing like if something is shadow or light, I can squint my eyes at it to try and decipher that.
Katie, I don't know if you might know about this, but does the hairspray increase the yellowing of a pastel drawing?
Yeah, I think it can. I think that's probably why I might not use it. And when you spray a drawing, you want to hold, you want to follow the directions on the can of spray, but you also would want to hold your drawing up vertically if you can. So like on a board, like lean it up against the side of a building or wherever you're spraying outside, right? And that's so you don't drip over the drawing. So if I have the can of spray and I'm like going across like this, coating it, if I were leaned down and the drawing were on the ground and I were holding the can over it, it could drip and leave marks on your drawing. So I would recommend spraying while the drawing is up vertically.
Katie, you are working from a still life in front of you. Could we see it again? Some folks have been asking about what you're drawing
Oh,
from
yeah,
and
sure.
whether some of it is from your imagination or, I mean, obviously the magenta background is kind of from your imagination, right?
Yeah, yeah, my walls aren't magenta. But yeah, so I'm thinking about, this is all I'm looking at right here. So it's on a white piece of paper. And yeah, and my table is sort of a wooden table, brownish wooden table. So I'm choosing colors based on the colors that these objects are. And I could have changed the colors of these objects too. That's a great thing that Sally Strand talks about. Like I'm plugging her, but she, you know, that's something that's an idea that she uses in her drawings, that if you understand light and shadow, like highlight, midtone, and shadow, then, you know, this idea of light and dark color, you can use any colors you want, right? It kind of frees you up to use more exciting color combinations. And have things still come out round, looking round, or dimensional. I want to see if I have, I'd really like to get a little bit more pink into this butternut squash.
So are you leaving the shadows as the color of the paper?
I'm thinking about it.
Cool.
Yeah, does anyone have any ideas? Do you want to see something different?
I personally don't know. I'm torn, but I'm waiting for folks to respond.
Okay.
What else could we see in the shadows?
I'm also kind of like, as I'm working, I'm making some parts of the table brighter than others. Like I'm leaning more heavily on the pastel and building it up a little bit more here than say I am right here. So these, I kind of don't want this to pop out as being the same kind of really bright light because it's in an area that's between shadows. Like I want that to kind of like sit in there with those shadows. So I'm not going to make this a super strong, bright shape. Whereas like other places, I might want to add a little bit more pastel to the paper. And this is the same color. I'm just kind of, I'm adding more material to the paper. And I'm still thinking about the green showing through. And so if I compare this, maybe I want to look at my other drawing here again. So this has a more of a, it's a little bit warmer, right? A little bit warmer and maybe warmer and lighter. And this has light in it, but I think that green undertone is kind of, it makes things a little more subtle, maybe. So these shadows that are made of greens and blues, they can kind of like sit back there with the paper a little bit. What I do like about this brownish paper, though, is how the delicata squash came out. I think if I kept working on this as a drawing, I would add a darker, I would keep extending this like darker space. to kind of accentuate that. And I would put a color for the shadow on this one, just because the brown of the paper is like a little too, has too much personality to it. I think I would want that to be more shadow-like, more faint.
Beautiful. I love the magenta background. It really makes this whole drawing come together and pop. It turned out so well, Katie.
Thanks, Vida.
Could you tell us the brand of the paper again? Did you say it was Canson?
It's Canson. It's, let me look at the label and tell you exactly. It's Canson, I really don't know how to say this. Tense. M-I, and the next word, T-E-I-N-T-E-S.
Great.
But that's the
And
type.
where do you usually go to purchase these? Like Dig Black or?
I really like Artisan Craftsman. That's my spot.
They are great. Well, we are just about out of time. If there's any other questions, we have just a couple of minutes. Please let us know. Otherwise, Katie, wow, what a beautiful demonstration. Such a gorgeous drawing. Thank you so much. I love the material. It's so satisfying somehow. And just really unique. So thank you so much for demonstrating and talking us through the process. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It was really great to see so many familiar faces. Do join us again on Thursday. We are gonna have a Nigerian and Ghanaian pottery demonstration and a little short lecture about the history of the processes. Otherwise, you can check out the rest of our events that are coming up on our calendar page. And we do hope you join us again. Thank you so much, everyone. Katie, thank you so much for tonight.
All right. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.